The countdown was already under 30 seconds when I threw myself under the coolant panel and started ripping out wires with my bare hands. Red light pulsed through the narrow maintenance shaft of the Orion Spire, the great alien station that orbited a dying star at the edge of Vantiri space. Somewhere above me, 3 alien engineers stood with their arms folded, watching me work instead of helping me. That was normal. Humans fixed things on this station. Vantiri nobles watched. 19 seconds, human, said the voice above me. It belonged to an engineer named Thren, tall and pale blue, with eyes like cut glass. He said the word human, the way some people say a bad smell. I heard you the first time, I said, my hands shaking as I traced the burnt wire back to its source. My name is Nathan Blake. 6 months ago, I was a maintenance engineer on a cargo hauler flying supply routes between Earth and Mars. Now, I was lying on my back inside the wall of an alien space station, trying to stop a coolant surge from turning an entire habitation ring into a tomb. 14 seconds, Thren said, almost cheerfully. I found it. A cracked regulator, no bigger than my thumb, leaking plasma into a line that was never built to handle it. I grabbed the spare from my belt, the one I had begged the quartermaster for that morning, because something about the old parts housing had looked wrong to me. Call it a hunch. Call it the kind of thing humans were apparently very good at, according to the reports nobody on this station had bothered to read. I slammed the new regulator into place and twisted it home. 5 seconds. I yanked my hands back just as the line shuddered, hissed, and then went silent. The red light above me flicked to a calm amber. Somewhere in the ring, 300 people, most of them Vantiri, most of them people who had never said a kind word to me, kept breathing. Nobody clapped. Nobody said thank you. Thren simply turned to the other 2 engineers and said something in his own language that made them laugh. I did not need a translator to know it was about me. I crawled out of the maintenance shaft, covered in grease, my hands trembling from the adrenaline draining out of them all at once. My supervisor, a broad Vantiri woman named Counselor Vesa Oren, was waiting with her arms crossed. "You cut it close," she said. "The part failed early. I caught it in time. You could have reported the fault an hour ago instead of waiting to be a hero." I wanted to tell her that I had reported it an hour ago, twice, and both times the request had been filed under low priority because it came from a human technician instead of a Vantiri one. I wanted to tell her that humanity had been part of the wider galaxy for less than 2 years, and we were already tired of being treated like clever animals that happened to be useful in an emergency. Instead, I said, "Understood, Counselor. I will file a report." She walked away without another word. That was the thing about the Vantiri Empire. They were not cruel exactly. They were simply certain, in their bones, that they were the center of everything worth being certain about. Humans were new. Humans were small. Humans had not yet earned the right to be listened to. My friend Oliver Grant found me 20 minutes later in the human quarters, a cramped section of the station where the ceilings were too low and the air recyclers groaned all night. Oliver was another engineer, tall, easygoing, the kind of man who could make a joke out of almost anything. "I heard you saved the ring," he said, tossing me a ration bar. "I heard you didn't help me do it. I was busy not dying somewhere else. You're welcome, by the way." He dropped into the seat across from me. "You look like something the recyclers spat out." "I feel like it too." I rubbed my eyes. 14 hours today, 14 hours yesterday. I don't think I've slept properly since we got here. "You know why they keep piling it on you," Oliver said, more gently now. "You're good. Too good. Makes them nervous." "Makes them use me harder, you mean?" "Same thing. On this station." He leaned back. "Grace says the princess is coming through engineering tomorrow. Full inspection tour. High command wants everything spotless." That got my attention, even through the exhaustion. Everyone on the Orion Spire knew the name Princess Elira Thane. She was heir to House Thane, one of the oldest and most powerful families in the Vantiri Empire, and she had been assigned to oversee frontier operations on this station as part of her training before she took her seat on the Imperial Council. I had seen her twice from a distance. Once at a formal address to the station, where she had spoken with a voice so calm and precise it barely seemed to move the air. Once in a corridor, walking fast, surrounded by advisors, not looking at anyone. She was, by every account I had heard, exactly what you would expect from Vantiri nobility. Cold, exact, utterly convinced that humans were an interesting footnote in a much larger and much older story. Wonderful, I said. Something else to be perfect for. Get some sleep, Oliver said, standing. You look like you're about to fall over. He wasn't wrong. I told him I would, and I meant it, but there was still a stack of maintenance logs to update before my shift technically ended, and updating them meant sitting at my station in the engineering bay, and sitting at my station in the engineering bay, after 14 hours awake and a countdown that had nearly cost me my hands, meant that somewhere around the 9th log entry, my eyes simply stopped opening again. I did not decide to fall asleep. It happened to me, the way the floor happens to you when you trip. One moment, I was typing a report about a faulty regulator. The next moment, the words on the screen blurred into nothing, my head tipped forward, and the engineering bay, with its low blue light and its constant hum of machinery, dissolved into darkness. I do not remember what I dreamed. I never do, but I have been told, more than once in my life, that when I am tired enough, when the exhaustion goes past a certain point, I talk. My mother used to tease me about it when I was a boy. My sister used to record it on her phone and play it back at breakfast. It was a family joke, the kind of thing that never mattered, because the only people who ever heard it loved me enough to laugh kindly. I had forgotten about it completely. Out here, 100 light years from home, surrounded by people who did not love me, who barely tolerated me, who would have had no reason at all to laugh kindly. I had no idea, slumped over my console with grease still on my hands and my mind finally, blessedly empty, that I was about to give the coldest woman on this entire station the first real laugh she had felt in years. I had no idea she was about to walk in and hear every word. The engineering bay at that hour was almost empty. Most of the day shift had gone to sleep, and the night shift had not yet begun. It was the kind of quiet you only get on a space station between shifts, when even the machines seemed to breathe slower. I was completely alone, or so I thought, folded over my console with my cheek against my forearm, dead to the world. Somewhere in that darkness, in the small unguarded country of sleep where nobody performs and nobody pretends, my mouth kept moving. And somewhere behind me, the door to the engineering bay slid open without a sound. Because Vantiri doors are built that way. Built to be silent. Built for people who like to arrive without announcing themselves. I did not hear the footsteps. I did not feel the shift of air as someone stopped a few feet behind my chair. I did not know that the exhausted, unfiltered, honest voice spilling quietly out of me had an audience. I only knew, an hour later, when I finally opened my eyes to a dark bay and a stiff neck, that something about the silence around me felt different, watched, waiting. I sat up too fast, my heart already pounding before my mind caught up to why. And that is when I saw her standing in the doorway, arms folded, one eyebrow raised, and an expression on her face that no report, no rumor, and no distant glimpse in a corridor had ever prepared me for. Princess Elira Thane was smiling. I froze. Every part of me went still, except my heartbeat, which was doing its best to hammer its way out of my chest. My first thought was that I had fallen asleep at my post, which on this station was a punishable offense. My second thought, arriving half a second later and far more terrifying, was that I had no idea what I had said while I was asleep, and judging by the look on her face, she did. Your Highness. I scrambled to my feet so fast my chair spun backward into the console behind me, sending a stack of data pads clattering to the floor. I did not chase after them. My eyes were locked on her, The way you look at a fire alarm when you are not yet sure if the building is actually burning. I am so sorry, I did not hear you come in. I was only resting my eyes for a moment. I can explain, the logs are almost... Nathan Blake, she said. I stopped talking. It was strange enough that she knew my name. It was stranger still how she said it, without the flat, bored disdain that most Vantiri used when addressing a human, and without the sharp correction of a superior about to discipline a subordinate. She said it almost carefully, as if she were turning the sounds over in her mouth to see how they fit. Yes, I managed. That's me. Do you know how long you were asleep? I do not, Your Highness. I am afraid I lost track of the time. An hour, she said. A little more. An hour. My stomach dropped somewhere around my boots. An hour was more than enough time for a great many things to be said, and judging by the way she was looking at me, a great many things had been. I understand if this warrants a formal report, I said, straightening my spine, trying to hold on to whatever dignity I had left. I take full responsibility. It will not happen again. A report. She repeated the word slowly, and something flickered at the corner of her mouth, something I did not have a name for yet because I had never seen it on her face before. Do you know, Nathan Blake, in 2 years of overseeing this station, I have sat through 400 reports. Fault reports, maintenance reports, discipline reports. Do you know how many of them made me laugh? I did not answer, because I understood, with a sinking, mortified certainty, exactly where this was going. None, she said, not one, until tonight. Your Highness, whatever I said, I assure you it was not meant. You called Councillor Thren a preening icicle with delusions of importance, she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted further, unmistakably now, into something that on a human face I would have called the beginning of a grin. You said, and I am quoting you directly, that if the Vantiri Empire wanted to conquer the galaxy with good manners alone, it would have already won 3 times over, because nobody in this station has ever once said thank you, but everybody has found the time to explain, at great length, how humans do not understand proper etiquette. Heat crawled up the back of my neck. I remembered none of it, but it sounded exactly like something my exhausted, unguarded brain would produce after 14 hours awake, and a near miss with a coolant surge. That is, I started, and had absolutely nothing to finish the sentence with. You also, she continued, and now there was no mistaking it. Her voice had a warmth in it that I had never once heard directed at anyone on this station, human or otherwise, spent a considerable amount of time discussing me. The floor of the engineering bay did not open up and swallow me, though I would have welcomed it if it had. I do not remember any of this, I said, which was true, and which sounded exactly as useless out loud as it had in my head. You called me, she said, tilting her head slightly, clearly enjoying herself now in a way that felt almost dangerous. And again, I am quoting you precisely, because I intend to remember this for the rest of my life, a magnificent piece of frozen artwork who has never once smiled at anyone in her entire existence, and who probably practices looking unimpressed in a mirror every morning before breakfast. I put my face in my hands. It did not help. The words were already out in the world, already heard, already apparently delighting the one person on this entire station who had the power to make my life significantly harder if she chose to. There is more, she said. Please, I said, my voice muffled through my fingers. Your Highness, I am begging you, there does not need to be more. You said, she continued, ignoring me completely, and I could hear now that she was fighting to keep her composure, that whatever this laugh was, it had been building in her for the better part of an hour, and was now very close to breaking free entirely, that underneath all that ice, you suspected there was probably a person in there somewhere, and that you almost felt sorry for her, because it must be exhausting, being that important, and that alone at the same time. The bay went very quiet. I lowered my hands from my face. Whatever I had expected to see on her, mockery, cold amusement, the particular satisfaction of a noble catching a servant in an embarrassing lapse. It was not what was actually there. Her eyes had changed. The sharp, polished distance I had seen in every previous glimpse of her was gone, replaced by something unguarded and slightly startled, as if she herself had not expected that last sentence to land the way it had. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then, without warning, Princess Alira Thane began to laugh. It was not the practiced, controlled sound I would have imagined from a woman raised inside an empire that valued composure above almost everything else. It was real. It came out of her in a rush, sudden and unguarded, her shoulders shaking, one hand rising to cover her mouth as if she could somehow put it back once it started. She turned half away from me, as though embarrassed by her own reaction, and the sound of it filled the empty engineering bay in a way that felt enormous, out of proportion to the room, out of proportion to everything I understood about who she was supposed to be. I stood there, grease on my hands, my chair still spinning slightly behind me, and watched the coldest, most untouchable person on the entire Orion spire laugh so hard she had to lean against the doorway to stay upright. "I am sorry," she said, when she finally caught her breath, though she did not sound sorry at all. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to stay and listen. I came in to review the coolant incident report before it reached my desk in the morning, and you were already asleep, and then you started talking, and I meant to leave. I truly did. But then you called Thren a preening icicle, and I simply could not make myself walk away." "I am going to lose my post," I said, mostly to myself. "You are not going to lose your post." She wiped at the corner of one eye, still smiling in a way that had not existed on her face 30 seconds earlier. "Nathan Blake, in 2 years on this station, no one has made me laugh. Not my advisors, who are far too careful with everything they say around me. Not my family, who have not laughed with me since I was a child too young to understand what my name would eventually cost me. Not one single person on this entire station, human or Vantiri, has ever said anything to me that was not filtered through what they thought I wanted to hear." "I promise you," I said, "if I had been awake, I would have filtered it a great deal." "I know," she said, and something in her voice shifted, quieter now, more thoughtful. "That is exactly why it mattered." I did not know what to say to that. I was standing in an engineering bay at an hour when I should have been asleep in my own quarters, having just been informed that I had spent the better part of an hour unconsciously insulting and, apparently, quietly defending the most powerful woman on the station, and she was looking at me now with an expression I had absolutely no experience reading on a Vantiri face. "I should return to my quarters," I finally said, because it seemed like the only sentence available to me that would not make things worse. "Before I say something else, I do not remember. Wait." She held up a hand, and the laughter faded from her face, replaced by something steadier, something almost businesslike, though the warmth underneath it did not disappear entirely. "The coolant failure tonight. Counselor Oren's report says you resolved it with 4 seconds to spare, using a replacement part you requisitioned on instinct against a work order that had been filed as low priority." "That is accurate, Your Highness." "How many times has that happened?" "An instinct, a hunch, catching something before the system does?" I thought about it honestly, for the first time all day, more than I could count. It is not always dramatic like tonight. Most of the time it is small. A sound that is slightly wrong, a reading that is off by a fraction nobody else would notice. My grandfather used to say, "Humans are good at worrying about things before they become disasters." I suppose it is true. She studied me for a long moment, and I had the distinct feeling that she was recalculating something, some assumption she had walked into this bay carrying that no longer quite fit. "Tomorrow," she said, "I am conducting a full inspection of the engineering ring, as I believe you already know. I would like you to walk it with me. Your Highness, with respect, Counselor Oren usually leads those tours. Counselor Oren will explain the systems to me the way the manuals explain them," she said. "I suspect you will tell me the truth about them instead." I did not know how to answer that, so I said the only thing that felt honest. I will do my best not to fall asleep during it. Something flickered across her face again, quick and unmistakable. That would be appreciated, though I confess, Nathan Blake, if you do, I am fairly certain I will not be the only one disappointed to miss what you might say next. She turned, before I could think of a response to that, and walked out through the silent door the same way she had come in, leaving me standing alone in the engineering bay with my chair still spinning and my entire understanding of the last 2 years quietly rearranging itself in my head. I did not sleep again that night, not because I was not tired, but because every time I closed my eyes I heard, in my imagination, an endless replay of every possible thing I might have said to her that she had not yet repeated back to me. Somewhere on this station, the most powerful woman I had ever met was walking back to her own quarters, and for the first time in longer than I wanted to think about, I was almost certain she was still smiling. The next morning, engineering looked like it was preparing for a coronation instead of an inspection. Every panel had been polished until it threw back the overhead lights. Every warning light had been tested twice. Counselor Oren walked the ring at dawn, barking instructions at anyone unlucky enough to be within earshot, and by the time the inspection party actually arrived, my hands were raw from scrubbing grease off surfaces that had never been clean in the 2 years I had worked there. Oliver found me straightening a rack of tools for the 3rd time. "You're twitchy today," he said. "Something happened last night?" "Nothing," I said too quickly. He raised an eyebrow, but let it go, mostly because at that exact moment, the far doors opened and the inspection party swept in, led by Counselor Oren and, 2 steps behind her, Princess Elira Thane. She looked exactly the way she had looked every other time I had seen her from a distance, composed, precise, dressed in the pale silver of House Thane, her dark hair pulled back in a style that looked like it had taken an hour and several assistants to achieve. Nothing in her posture or expression suggested that 12 hours earlier she had been leaning against a doorway, laughing so hard she nearly lost her balance. For one horrible moment, I wondered if I had imagined the entire thing. Exhaustion does strange things to a mind. Perhaps I had dreamed the laughing too, dreamed the whole conversation, and I was about to make a fool of myself, expecting some acknowledgement that would never come. Then her eyes found mine across the bay, and just for a fraction of a second, so brief that no one else in the room could possibly have caught it, one corner of her mouth twitched. I had not imagined it. "Counselor Oren," she said, her voice carrying that same calm precision I remembered from her public address. "Walk me through the coolant regulation systems, please." Oren launched into an explanation that sounded like it had been copied directly from a technical manual, full of proper terminology and careful praise for the engineering team's diligence, none of which mentioned that the actual system had nearly failed 12 hours earlier and had only been saved by a human technician acting against orders. I stood near the back of the group with the other engineers, trying to look useful and unremarkable at the same time, which is a difficult combination to manage. "And the failure last night," the princess said, cutting smoothly into the middle of Oren's explanation. "I understand it was resolved quickly." Oren's expression flickered, just slightly. "Yes, Your Highness. Standard response protocols were followed. Standard protocols would have taken 60 seconds to authorize a replacement part requisition through proper channels," the princess said, still perfectly calm. "The regulator failed, with less than 30 seconds remaining. I am curious how standard protocol accounted for that gap." The bay went quiet. Oren's jaw tightened. I felt every set of eyes in the room, human and Vantiri alike, slowly turn toward me, because everyone present already knew the answer, even if they had been hoping not to say it out loud in front of noble company. "The technician on duty exercised initiative," Oren finally said, choosing her words the way someone chooses stepping stones across a river they do not trust. "Which technician?" the princess said, and though her tone had not changed at all, I understood, with a small jolt, that she already knew exactly which technician, and was asking anyway, in front of everyone, because she wanted me to be named out loud. "Nathan Blake," I said, stepping forward before Oren could answer for me. It felt safer to claim it myself than to have it handed to me like an accusation. I requisitioned a replacement regulator earlier in the day based on wear patterns I noticed during a routine check. When the original failed, I already had the part on hand. The princess turned to look at me directly, and for a moment the entire inspection party seemed to disappear around the edges of my vision, leaving just the two of us standing in a room full of witnesses who had no idea what had happened between us the night before. "You noticed wear patterns that the automated diagnostic systems did not flag," she said. "Yes, Your Highness." "Is that common among humans?" I glanced at Oren, whose expression had settled into the careful blankness of someone who did not want to be seen agreeing or disagreeing with anything happening in front of royalty. "I cannot speak for every human," I said carefully, "but many of us grew up fixing things that were already old and already breaking before we ever touched them. We tend to notice small wrongness before it becomes large wrongness. It is not magic. It is mostly just paying attention to things nobody else thinks are worth watching." Something in her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable to me now that I had seen its opposite the night before. "That is a valuable skill," she said, loudly enough for the entire party to hear. "One this station has apparently been undervaluing." She turned back to Oren. "I want a full review of how maintenance requisitions from human staff are prioritized. If a fault that nearly compromised an entire habitation ring was flagged hours in advance and treated as low priority, that is not a technician failure. That is a systems failure." Oren's face went carefully neutral, in the particular way of someone absorbing a public correction and deciding not to show it. "Understood, Your Highness. I will conduct the review personally." The inspection continued for another hour, moving through the rest of engineering with the same mixture of formal explanation and pointed questions from the princess, who seemed, now that I was watching for it, to be asking questions designed less to test the systems and more to test who actually understood them. More than once her gaze drifted toward me before I even spoke, as though she already suspected what I would say and wanted to hear it confirmed. When the tour finally ended, the party began filing out, and I allowed myself to exhale for what felt like the first time in an hour. I was gathering my tools when Counselor Oren's voice cut across the bay. "Blake, the princess wishes a word. Alone." My stomach did something complicated. I set down my tools and walked toward where Illyra Thane stood near the far wall, waiting until the last of the inspection party had cleared the room before she spoke. "You handled that well," she said. "I told the truth, Your Highness. I did not realize that counted as handling something well around here." "It rarely does," she said, and there was a dryness in her voice that I was beginning to recognize as something close to humor, carefully controlled but genuinely there. "Most people, human or otherwise, tell me what they believe I want to hear. It becomes very difficult to know anything true about the systems I am responsible for, or the people running them, when everyone is performing for my benefit." "For what it is worth," I said, "I was fairly certain you already knew the requisition timeline before you asked." "You did not need me to confirm it." "I did not," she agreed. "I needed Oren and everyone else in that room to hear you confirm it. There is a difference between me knowing something and this station knowing it. I considered that. You wanted them to hear it from a human, in front of you, so they could not quietly bury it later." "Yes." Something like approval crossed her face. "You are quicker than most of my own advisors, Nathan Blake." "I have had a great deal of practice being underestimated," I said. "It sharpens a person." She almost smiled at that, catching herself halfway, glancing toward the door, as though checking that no one had wandered back in to see it. "Walk with me," she said. "There is a viewing platform near the outer ring that is rarely used. I would like to speak with you, somewhere Oren is not listening to every word, for a report she can file later." I should have said no. Every rule I understood about the relationship between humans and Vantiri nobility told me that walking alone with the heir of House Thane was the kind of thing that ended careers, or worse, and I had already had one very long lesson that morning in how quickly a human could become the center of unwanted attention on this station. But there was something in the way she asked, something that did not sound like an order at all, that made refusing feel almost cruel. "Lead the way, Your Highness." The viewing platform was exactly as she had described it, a quiet, curved stretch of transparent hull near the edge of the ring, looking out over the slow-burning red of the dying star the station orbited. Nobody else was there. The silence, after the noise of engineering, felt enormous. "You do not have to keep calling me Your Highness when it is only the two of us," she said, once we were alone, looking out at the star instead of at me. "It is exhausting, hearing my own title said back to me 100 times a day by people who use it instead of actually seeing me. What would you prefer?" "Illyra," she said. "Just that. That feels like the kind of thing that could get a person in a great deal of trouble. Only if someone finds out," she said. And this time, the smile did reach her face fully, unguarded, the same one I had seen the night before. "You already know a great many things about me that could get you in trouble, Nathan Blake. One more secret hardly changes the math." I laughed despite myself, some of the tension in my shoulders finally loosening. "Fair enough. Illyra then. And you can drop the Blake. Nathan is fine." "Nathan," she repeated, testing the sound of it the way she had the night before, and I found I did not mind hearing my own name in her voice nearly as much as I probably should have. We stood there for a while, watching the star burn slow and red beyond the hull, and she told me, without my asking, about what it meant to be heir to House Thane. About a childhood spent memorizing court protocols instead of playing, about a mother who had died when Illyra was young, and a father who had never quite recovered from it, and who now spoke to his daughter mostly through formal correspondence delivered by advisors rather than in person. About being sent to command this remote frontier station, not because anyone thought she was needed here, but because it kept her far enough from the capital that certain rival houses could not use her as a piece in whatever game they were currently playing. "It sounds lonely," I said when she finished. "It is," she said simply, without self-pity, as though she were describing the weather. "It has been lonely for a very long time. I stopped noticing it, mostly. Until last night, when a very tired human fell asleep at his console and accidentally reminded me what it felt like to be looked at as a person instead of a title. I did not have a clever response to that. I only had the truth. For what it is worth, everything I apparently said, even the parts that were unkind, none of it was performance. I do not know how to be anything else when I am that exhausted. There was no version of me managing what you were supposed to hear." "I know," she said. "That is precisely why I believed it." We talked longer than either of us probably should have, about small things after that, about Earth and what oceans looked like from orbit, about the strange Vantiri custom of naming ships after emotions instead of places, about nothing important at all, which somehow felt like the most important conversation I had had since arriving on this station. It was the kind of conversation that happens between two people who have decided, without saying so out loud, that they no longer need to perform for each other. It was Illyra who eventually broke the moment, glancing at a small device on her wrist and sighing, "I am due at a council session. My advisors will already be wondering where I have gone. Will this cause trouble for you?" I asked, being seen with me. She considered the question seriously, which I appreciated, rather than dismissing it the way someone might, if they had not actually thought about the risk. "There are people in this empire, some of them quite close to the throne, who believe humanity should be kept at arm's length until you have proven yourselves worthy of closer alliance. My own father is not entirely unsympathetic to that view. There are others, further from the throne, but not without teeth, who believe humans should not be trusted at all. A counselor named Kessian Draith has said as much, publicly, more than once." "That sounds like a name I should remember." "It is," she said, and for the first time since we had stepped onto the platform, something wary crossed her face, quick and gone. "Lord Kessian has interests on this station that have nothing to do with human relations. though he uses that argument freely when it suits him. Be careful of him, Nathan, if your paths ever cross. He is the kind of man who smiles at you while calculating exactly how useful your downfall might be to him. Noted, I said. Though I confess, I did not expect my first real conversation with a princess to end with a warning about a political enemy. Welcome to the Vantiri Empire, she said, and the warmth returned to her voice, chasing the wariness away. Nothing is ever simple here, not even laughing at a sleeping engineer. She left the platform a few minutes later, and I stood alone for a long time after that, watching the dying star burn slow and red, thinking about a woman who had spent her entire life being seen as a title instead of a person, and about a name, Kessian Draith, that I had a strange and certain feeling I had not heard for the last time. The alarm that tore through the Orion spire 11 days later was not the kind I had heard before. It was not the low, familiar hum of a maintenance fault or a coolant warning. It was a sharp, layered shriek that made every Vantiri crew member within earshot go pale, and within seconds, Oliver was gripping my shoulder, his voice tight. "That's a security breach signal," he said. "Full lockdown. Something's gotten onto the station." We were in the engineering bay, halfway through a routine diagnostic, when the announcement came through the overhead speakers in clipped, urgent Vantiri, followed a moment later by a translated human version. An unauthorized vessel had docked at a service airlock on the outer ring, bypassing station security through a code that should not have existed. Armed intruders were loose somewhere in the lower decks. All non-essential personnel were ordered to shelter in place. My first thought, sharp and sudden and entirely unwelcome, was Illyra. I did not think it through. I did not weigh the risk or consider the dozen reasons I should stay exactly where I was and let station security handle whatever was happening. I simply grabbed the closest tool bag, because a tool bag was the only weapon-shaped object within reach, and started moving toward the upper ring, where I knew from the inspection tour and every scrap of station gossip that the princess kept her private quarters and conducted her council sessions. "Nathan, are you out of your mind?" Oliver caught up to me in 3 long strides, grabbing my arm. "That's the opposite direction of shelter. What are you doing?" "Illyra has a council session scheduled this hour," I said, not slowing down. "The upper ring is where the intruders would want to be if this isn't a random raid." "That's not our fight," Oliver said, though I noticed he had not let go of my arm and was matching my pace instead of pulling me back. "We're technicians, not soldiers. We don't even have weapons." "I have a tool bag and a very bad feeling," I said. "You don't have to come." He swore under his breath, the kind of curse that meant he had already decided to come and was only complaining about it for form's sake, and we ran together through corridors that emptied faster than I had ever seen them empty, station personnel diving into shelter rooms as the lockdown protocol swept through the ring ahead of us. We reached the access corridor outside the council chamber just in time to see 2 figures in unmarked armor dragging a wounded Vantiri guard away from the chamber doors, which had been forced half open, their locking mechanism sparking uselessly. Through the gap, I could see the council session had scattered, advisors pressed against the far wall, and in the center of the chamber, Illyra stood facing a 3rd armored figure whose weapon was leveled directly at her chest. "Lord Kessian sends his regards," the armored figure said, in Vantiri-accented common speech, clearly meant for the benefit of anyone listening, and his sincere hope that House Thane's line ends quietly, here, without further embarrassment to the Empire. Illyra did not flinch, though I was close enough now to see her hands were shaking slightly at her sides. "You will not leave this station alive," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "Every exit is already sealed." "We are not planning to leave," the figure said, and something in the flatness of the statement made my blood run cold. I had exactly no plan, no weapon worth the name, and no business at all being anywhere near this situation. What I had was a tool bag, 14 years of experience keeping my head when machines were failing around me, and a strange, burning certainty that I was not going to stand in this corridor and watch. The two armored figures who had dragged the wounded guard away were now turning toward the corridor, toward us, weapons rising. Oliver grabbed my arm again, harder this time. Nathan. I did not have time to think it through as carefully as I would have liked. I grabbed the heaviest tool from my bag, a magnetic clamp gun used for securing hull panels during repairs, and did the only thing I could think of that might buy us any advantage at all. I fired it, not at the intruders, but at the overhead lighting conduit above them, the same kind of conduit I had spent 2 years learning to fix, and therefore understood exactly how to break. The clamp struck the housing dead center. Sparks rained down, and the corridor lights above the two armored figures shattered in a shower of hot glass and current, plunging that section into darkness and setting off a secondary alarm that flooded the corridor with a piercing, disorienting siren. It was not a weapon. It was chaos, manufactured on purpose, the same principle I had used 100 times to buy myself 30 extra seconds during an equipment failure. Confuse the system, interrupt the sequence, create an opening. It worked better than I had any right to expect. The two intruders staggered, momentarily blind and half-deafened, and in that same instant I heard running feet behind us as a squad of station security, finally cutting through the lockdown chaos, arrived at the far end of the corridor and opened fire on the disoriented figures before they could recover their bearings. That left the third intruder, the one inside the chamber, the one with a weapon still leveled at Illyra. I did not have another clamp gun trick for that one. What I had was momentum, and a corridor full of scattered debris from the broken conduit, and about 4 seconds before the last intruder registered that his cover had just collapsed into chaos behind him. I ran. I do not remember deciding to run. I remember the tool bag slipping from my shoulder, the shattered glass crunching under my boots, Oliver shouting something behind me that I did not process at the time, and only understood later was him telling me to get down. I remember reaching the broken chamber doors and seeing the armored figure's head start to turn toward the new noise behind him, weapon beginning to swing away from Illyra and toward the threat approaching from the corridor. I hit him at a dead run, shoulder first, with every ounce of momentum 14 years of hauling equipment on cargo ships had ever put into my frame. It was not graceful. It was not the kind of thing a trained soldier would have done, and every part of my body was screaming by the time we both went down hard onto the chamber floor, his weapon skittering away across the polished stone. I do not remember much of what happened in the next few seconds, only fragments. A gauntleted fist catching me across the jaw hard enough that the room briefly doubled, the taste of blood, the armored figure twisting beneath me, stronger than I was, clearly trained for exactly this kind of fight in a way I very much was not. I remember thinking, with a strange, distant clarity, that I was very likely about to lose this fight badly. And then Illyra was there. I did not see exactly what she did. I only heard the sound, a sharp crack of something heavy against armor, and felt the weight beneath me suddenly go still. When my vision cleared enough to focus, she was standing over both of us, breathing hard, holding a broken piece of the chamber's ceremonial staff, the kind of decorative object nobody had ever expected to be used as a weapon, her knuckles white around it. Nathan. Her voice cracked on my name in a way I had never heard from her before, all the careful composure gone entirely. Nathan, are you? I'm fine, I said, which was not entirely true, given the blood I could feel running from my split lip and the way the room was still tilting slightly. Are you hurt? No, she said, dropping to her knees beside me, her hands hovering over me, as though she did not quite trust herself to touch me and confirm I was real. No, I am not hurt, because of you. Station security flooded the chamber a moment later, medics close behind them, and the next several minutes dissolved into the kind of controlled chaos that follows any crisis. Shouted reports, hands checking me for injuries I insisted I did not have, Counselor Oren's voice somewhere in the background, demanding to know how a human technician had ended up in the middle of an assassination attempt against the Princess of House Thane. Through all of it, Illyra did not leave my side. Not when the medics wanted to move me to the infirmary. Not when her own advisors, visibly shaken, tried to steer her attention toward the aftermath of the attack and the urgent question of how Lord Kessian's people had gotten a docking code they should never have possessed. She stayed close, one hand resting on my shoulder as if to reassure herself I was still there, still breathing, still real. "You could have died," she said quietly, once the worst of the chaos had thinned. "You had no weapon, no training for this. You are a maintenance technician, Nathan. You had absolutely no reason to run into that corridor." "I had a reason," I said, wincing as a medic pressed a cold patch against my split lip. "I just didn't stop to think about whether it was a good one." "What reason?" I looked at her, exhausted and bleeding, and entirely unable, at that moment, to filter myself the way I had spent an entire lifetime learning to filter myself around people who mattered. The same one I apparently talked about in my sleep 2 weeks ago, before I even knew you were listening. Something in her face broke open at that, some careful wall finally giving way completely, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all, surrounded by the wreckage of the chamber and the sound of security officers securing the last of the intruders, while somewhere in the back of my aching skull I registered, distantly, that I had just done something no amount of caution would have ever let me do if I had actually stopped to think it through first. I had run toward danger for her without hesitation, and judging by the look on her face, she had understood exactly why, faster than I had understood it myself. The infirmary kept me overnight, mostly as a precaution, and by the time they released me the following morning, the entire station already knew what had happened in that council chamber. I could tell by the way people looked at me in the corridors, Vantiri and human alike, a mixture of disbelief and something close to respect that I had never once seen directed at a human technician before. Thren, the engineer who had mocked me during the coolant crisis 2 weeks earlier, actually stopped me near the mess hall and, in halting, uncomfortable words, thanked me for what I had done. I did not know what to say to that, so I simply nodded and let him walk away with whatever dignity the moment allowed him. Councillor Oren summoned me to her office that afternoon, and I went expecting a reprimand for recklessness, for abandoning my post during a lockdown, for engaging armed intruders with nothing but a tool bag and poor judgment. Instead, she stood when I entered, which she had never done before, and told me that station security had reviewed the full record of the incident and confirmed that my improvised disruption of the corridor lighting had directly enabled the security squad to neutralize both outer intruders without casualties, and that my intervention in the council chamber had almost certainly prevented the assassination of the Princess of House Thane. "There will be a formal commendation," Oren said, her voice carefully professional, but her eyes betraying something warmer underneath. "The first one issued to a human on this station. Possibly the first issued to a human anywhere in the Empire." "I wasn't thinking about commendations," I said honestly. "I was thinking I might not survive the next 30 seconds. "That," Oren said, "is precisely why it matters. You did not calculate the odds and choose the safe path. You simply moved. My people are trained from childhood to weigh consequence before action. It makes us careful. It also apparently makes us slow, in exactly the moments when slow gets someone killed." She studied me for a long moment. "I have spent 2 years believing humans were useful but undisciplined. I am reconsidering that assessment. The investigation into Lord Kessian Dreath moved quickly after that. The docking code used by the intruders traced back through 3 layers of falsified authorization to a private channel registered under his household seal, and within a week, Imperial investigators had arrived from the capital to formally strip him of his council seat pending trial. I heard, second-hand, through Grace, who worked in station communications and heard everything eventually, that Kessian's plan had never really been about eliminating humans from Vantiri space at all. It had been about eliminating Alira specifically, before her father's failing health forced an early succession, clearing a path for a rival branch of the Imperial line that Kessian had quietly served for years. The anti-human rhetoric had simply been useful cover, a convenient excuse that played well with a certain faction of the court while hiding the actual target of the whole operation. Turns out, He didn't even really care about us, Oliver said, shaking his head over dinner one evening. We were just the story he told while he tried to murder a princess. Doesn't make the story any less dangerous, I said. People believed it. Some of them still do. Fewer than before, Grace pointed out. You should hear how the Vantiri crew talk about you now. Half the station thinks you're some kind of secret soldier they trained us wrong about. The other half just thinks you're insane. Both might be true, Oliver said, grinning, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually laughed without the tightness in my chest that usually accompanied being the center of attention on this station. Illyra and I did not see each other often in the days that followed. Her time was consumed by the aftermath of the attack, by council sessions dealing with Kessian's fallout, by urgent correspondence with her father and the imperial capital about succession security and station protocols. I understood, without needing to be told, that a princess could not simply set aside the machinery of an empire to spend her evenings with a human engineer, no matter what had passed between us in that chamber. I went back to my work, back to maintenance logs and coolant regulators and the ordinary rhythm of the station, and told myself that whatever had happened between us belonged to that one extraordinary night and did not necessarily belong to the ordinary days that followed it. I was wrong about that, though it took 3 weeks for me to be proven wrong. The message came through my personal console late one evening, formatted in the careful, formal style of official station correspondence, which made my stomach drop slightly when I first saw it, half convinced it was some kind of disciplinary summons after all. It was not. It was an invitation, in Illyra's own hand rather than dictated to an assistant, asking whether I would be willing to join her for what she called, with obvious care in the wording, an informal discussion regarding ongoing improvements to human integration policy aboard the Orion Spire. I recognized it immediately for what it actually was. An excuse. A door left carefully open by someone who did not yet know how to simply say what she meant without wrapping it in official language first. I said yes. The meeting, when it happened, took place on the same quiet viewing platform where we had first talked as equals, looking out over the same slow-burning star. She arrived in less formal attire than I had ever seen her wear, her hair loose instead of arranged, and something in the set of her shoulders told me that whatever exhaustion had been building in her over the last 3 weeks of council sessions and investigations had finally caught up with her completely. "You look tired," I said, before I could stop myself. "I am exhausted," she admitted, with none of the careful diplomatic language she used everywhere else on this station. "I have not slept properly since the attack. Every time I close my eyes, I see that weapon pointed at me, and then I see you running toward it instead of away, and I cannot decide whether I am more frightened by the memory or more grateful for it. For what it's worth," I said, "I haven't been sleeping well either. Turns out nearly dying leaves an impression." She almost smiled at that, though it did not quite reach her eyes. I read the formal integration proposal my council drafted, the one I used as an excuse to invite you here. It is thorough. It addresses requisition priority, disciplinary equity, representation in station governance. It is everything my advisors believe should be changed. But I did not actually invite you here to discuss policy," she said, finally meeting my eyes directly. "I invited you here because I have spent 3 weeks pretending that what happened between us in that chamber was simply gratitude, and I am too tired tonight to keep pretending that convincingly. I did not know what to say to that, so for once, I did not try to say anything clever. I ran into that corridor for you, Illyra. Not for the Empire, not for human relations policy, not for any commendation Orin's people wanted to give me afterward. I did it because some part of me had already decided, probably around the time you laughed so hard you had to hold on to a doorway, that I could not stand the idea of anything happening to you." "I know," she said quietly. "I have known since the chamber. I simply did not know what to do with knowing it." We stood there for a long while after that, not saying much, watching the dying star the way we had the first time, except this time the silence between us did not feel careful or uncertain. It felt earned. "I am exhausted," she said again, eventually, leaning slightly against the transparent hull. Truly exhausted. In a way, I do not think I have allowed myself to be in front of anyone since I was a child. You could rest, I said. Just for a while, I'll stay if you want company. She looked at me for a long moment, something considering and warm passing behind her eyes, and then, without further argument, she settled onto the small bench that ran along the edge of the viewing platform and closed her eyes. I sat beside her, close enough that our shoulders touched, and within minutes her breathing had slowed into the steady rhythm of someone who had finally, truly, let herself rest. I did not intend to fall asleep myself. I had told myself I would simply keep watch, let her rest without worry, stay alert in case anyone came looking for either of us. But 3 weeks of my own broken sleep, stacked on top of the slow, warm quiet of that platform, and the star burning steady and red beyond the hull, pulled me under before I even noticed it happening. I do not know how long we slept there together. I only know what I was told afterward, by Alira herself, laughing in that same unguarded way I had first heard weeks earlier in an empty engineering bay, that at some point in my sleep I had apparently reached over, without waking, and taken her hand, and murmured something about not letting preening icicles or ambitious counselors or entire empires get in the way of the first real thing I had found out here among the stars. She told me she had woken to hear it, and had lain there quietly for a long while afterward, not moving, not wanting to wake me and lose the sound of it, the same way I imagined she must have stood quietly in that engineering bay weeks before, unwilling to interrupt something so honest it could only exist while I was too tired to guard it. When I finally woke, the star outside had shifted slightly in its slow burn, and Alira was watching me with an expression I had never seen on her in all the months I had known her, open and warm, and entirely without the careful distance that had once seemed permanently built into her face. "You did it again," she said softly. "Did what?" "Talked in your sleep." Her mouth curved into that same unguarded smile I remembered from the very beginning of all of this. Though this time, I think I finally understand exactly what I heard. I felt my face heat, the same mortified warmth I had felt weeks earlier, waking up to find her standing in a doorway, except this time there was no dread underneath it, only something that felt suspiciously close to happiness. "Are you going to tell me what I said, or are you going to make me suffer the way you did the first time?" "I think," she said, leaning closer, "I would rather show you instead." Outside the viewing platform, the dying star burned on the way it had burned, for longer than either of our civilizations had existed, indifferent to empires and rivalries and the slow, careful architecture of Vantiri protocol. And on a quiet stretch of hull, far from the noise of council chambers and command decks, a princess who had spent her entire life being seen as a title finally let herself be seen as a person, by a tired human engineer who had never meant to fall asleep talking about her in the first place, and who, given the chance to do it all again, would not have changed a single exhausted, unguarded word of it. Word of what had happened between the heir of House Thane and a human technician spread through the Orion spire faster than any official announcement could have managed, and faster still through the wider empire once Illyra's father, weakened, but still sharp enough to recognize a shift in the political winds when he saw one, quietly signaled that House Thane would not object to the arrangement, provided it served the Empire's growing interest in strong human alliance. Whether that interest had existed before Kessian's failed conspiracy exposed how dangerous that particular prejudice could become in the wrong hands, or whether it only crystallized afterward, was a question historians would argue about for years. I did not much care about the politics of it, not really. I cared about the fact that somewhere on a station orbiting a dying star, a woman who had once been told she must always be composed, always be careful, always be exactly what her title demanded, had found someone in front of whom she no longer had to be any of those things. As for me, I went back to fixing coolant regulators and requisitioning parts on instinct, though Counselor Oren never again filed one of my reports as low priority, and Thren, of all people, eventually became something close to a friend, though neither of us ever spoke of it in those exact words. I still fell asleep exhausted more often than I would have liked, buried in logs and diagnostics long after my shift technically ended, but I no longer worried about who might overhear the unguarded things I said in my sleep, because the one person who had ever truly listened had already heard the worst and the best of it, and had chosen, laughing, to stay anyway.